coming pretty soon when if you want to go somewhere, you get on your cell phone and dial up a car, and after a while, a robot car will pull up in your driveway. The fee will be paid from your credit card. You just dial up where you want to go, and the car will take you where you want to go. That's almost upon us. We're not there yet, but it's almost there. All right. All right, let's see. Immigration. Immigration was a big issue at this time, even as it is today. I'll tell you what, though, I'll take about that, but I'm going to save immigration for the next chapter. I have already mentioned, I'll mention it again, Mark Twain. Mark Twain wrote Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. If you see Mark Twain on the testimony, well, just make sure you know he was an American author, you could even say humorist. He poked fun at the hypocrisies of his day. Mark Twain, humorist, author. Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn both found themselves in all kinds of mishaps. They were popular reading in my day. I'm afraid the younger generation has not read them as much. All right, we had inventors at that time. Two of the more famous were Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Well, you can put it this way, he's credited with it. Now, both the telephone and the automobile were invented by more than a dozen people, actually maybe scores of people, all at the same time. The reason Bell is credited was when Bell made his first phone call to his friend Watson, who was I think Watson was above him. You know, one of the men climbed upstairs, the other stayed down, and one of them heard the other one. But they wrote a letter immediately where they documented the date and time that this thing occurred. Well, both in Europe and North America, several men claimed to have invented the telephone. But because Bell had documentation as to when he did his first call, his claim was upheld by the courts. So he's given credit for it, even though when the technology was right. Same way with the automobile. We don't know who invented the automobile. I had a person tell me Henry Ford. No, Henry Ford definitely did not. He simply made the first one, mass-produced the first ones, but he did not invent the automobile. But for the automobile, when the technology was there, people were producing cars right and left all over the place. Same way, Alexander Graham Bell came from Europe. His wife was deaf, so he earned his living trying to teach deaf people to talk. You may not know, but deaf people, because they don't hear, they can usually not talk either. But he tried to teach deaf people to talk, including his wife, and he had some success at it, so that's what got him interested in audio. And he developed a little diaphragm that had an electromagnet around it, and this diaphragm led to the... Anyone know what I'm talking about? This diaphragm led to the invention of the speaker, the microphone. Oh yeah, some of you. If you take some of the old-fashioned speakers apart, you'll find they have coils of wire, usually wrapped around a magnet. The coils of wire make the diaphragm vibrate. Today's stuff is made a little bit different, it's digital. Now, Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison has secured more than 1,000 patents, and he secured more patents than any one man. All right, I want to say this about these inventors. Today, most of your inventions today are invented by teams of men, by corporations. But in those days, talented men would invent, and Thomas Edison was one of the last of the talented inventors. Now, I want to say this. Just last week, a man died who was credited with inventing the handheld calculator. This does have a calculator on it. But the handheld calculator, he got a patent on it in 1969, but he did not have all the bugs worked out of it. He did not actually start selling them until 1974. That's when I saw my first one. I thought, I want to figure out how this works, so I took one apart, and all I could see was a bunch of rectangular shaped objects interconnected. Today I have some idea how they work. All they do is they add binary numbers, ones and zeros, and then they have a chip that converts that binary to hexadecimal, and other chips that takes care of the input a certain number, and it goes through a processor. But anyway, it took me years to eventually figure out how they worked. Not that I could put one together now, because I can't. But his invention led to the invention of the microprocessor, the microchip, that's essential for building cell phones and computers. But again, it was up to the corporations to invent the microprocessor. But then back to Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison's more famous invention was the light bulb. He also invented the record player, phonograph, the tape recorder, and he improved on the telephone and the telegraph. He did not invent either one, but he made improvements on both. I'll say this, most of the inventions I've seen in my lifetime have been improvements on what already existed. For instance, the car I drove in here in is, much, much, much better than my dad's cars. The cars my dad, you had to replace the tires every 3 or 4 months. The tires I'm using last about 4 or 5 years apiece. You have to replace the muffler about every 2 or 3 months. The cars I drive today, the mufflers last as long as the car. Wheel bearings, I've never replaced a wheel bearing on a car, not since I was an adult. Again, today's cars are much, much better built. So again, most of the inventions that have been made have been improvements on ways of doing things, improvements even on ways of making cloth. The clothing we wear today is made by processes that have improved over the clothing we wore back when I was younger. I will say this, so I took part in the movie First Man, and they required us all to dress like 1969. And I do believe that people back then dressed better than a lot of us do today, but that's just my opinion. All right. Anyway, now there's another story going around Thomas Edison. When Thomas Edison, throughout most of his life, he was what you'd call an atheist. He did not believe in any kind of a God. But then the last 10 years of life is the case of a lot of atheists. He became an agnostic. He was open up to the possibility of not only that there's a God, but the possibility of an afterlife. So he went to a certain room in his house, and he had a picture. He hung a picture up, and he said to his family, his wife and his children who were alive, he said, now, when I'm gone, I'm going to find a way to come back using electricity. And when I come back, I'm going to move this picture. When you see this picture move, you'll know that I've been here. The family is somewhat embarrassed by it, but every once in a while, one of them will go into that room and look at the picture. It has not been moved. I will say this about Thomas Edison. I mean, I've told you, I'm a ham operator. In some ways, I might know more electricity than he did. No, I'm not greater than he was, not as smart as he was, but nevertheless, he lived in a different time era than me. And the only reason if I know more than he did is because I came after him. Like one inventor said, the reason I'm so tall is I'm sitting on the shoulders of giants. The giants of his day were shorter than the giants of my day. And another weakness, and these men had serious weaknesses. Thomas Edison did not understand alternating current. Now, he tried to generate and market direct current. The problem with it is direct current will only flow over a wire no more than about 2 miles. So if you can imagine an electrical generator every 1.5 miles or 2 miles apart, with alternating current, you can haul current more than 1,000 miles across. What you do is you step up that alternating current to 10,000 volts, put it on a high wire high up, and then step it down to 440 volts and put it in your wires, and then it's put it in your homes at 220, 110. Many of you know what I'm talking about. 60 cycle AC, 220 volts. 220 volts is still needed to run your central air units, to run a lot of your clothes dryers, and to run your electric ranges if you use one. We use gas. A few things, if we have to have 224, let me tell you this, unless you really know what you're doing, don't mess with a 220 volt circuit, folks. It can really hurt you. But anyway, in our country, we use 110 volts, 60 cycle. Go to Europe, they use 50 cycles. Go to most places in the world, they use 50 cycles and 200 volts. Again, any of you been to these places where they use alternating current of 50 cycle instead of 60? Any of you have been? I have. And you have to have a power converter to convert you can't convert to 50 cycles, the 50 to 60, but you can convert the voltage from 220 to 110. Alternating current enables you to step up voltage and step down voltage, which you can't do easily with direct current. It can be done, but it's much more difficult, much more involved. But again, Thomas Edison did not understand alternating currents, so we owe another man, I'm going to mention him, a man I had not heard of, Tesla. Nikola Tesla gave us alternating current, without which it's difficult to imagine what we have here at this school today. If this sort of school were run by direct current, it would be most difficult. But Nikola Tesla, now your book does mention another man who, he and Edison hated each other, a man named Westinghouse. Westinghouse invented a lot of devices like the refrigerator. I'm not going to mention him, but your book does. I'm not going to write him down, I'm going to write him down. Tesla fell out of favor and was forgotten about for 100 years, but lately there's been an effort to revive his memory. Westinghouse, he gave his name to a lot of products, including the Westinghouse stove, the Westinghouse, the Westinghouse television, and a lot of other Westinghouse refrigerator. You know, we had some Westinghouse products when I was growing up. All right. Again, these inventors did a lot to help America. If you study the history of science, there was a whole lot going on in the field of science right then that has determined where we are today. Of course, there was Edison, there was alternating current, but there are persons who say that some of the scientists back then took us in a direction that has actually set science back. Among them, men like Charles Darwin, who gave us natural selection. That does not do what he claimed it would do. Natural selection destroys genetic information, it does not build it. All right. I could elaborate more on that, but it's not part of the lesson, so I won't. A couple of women, do you remember? Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Some years ago, I had a silver dollar with Susan B. Anthony's picture on it. They decided to put her picture on the silver dollar. This is it's about the size of a quarter, but it's not round like a quarter. It has rippled edges to make sure that candy machines would not mistake it for a quarter. But the Susan B. Anthony silver dollar, these women pushed hard to try to get women the right to vote, and it was a difficult thing to do for them, but eventually it happened. Norway was the first country to give its women the right to vote, but some states did, particularly western states. Wyoming gave women the right to vote before it became a national law. Then Arizona followed, 2 western states. World War I did a whole lot to elevate women. During World War I, most European countries sent its prime young men to the front lines, and then women had to run the factories and stay at home and tend to most of the businesses. And that's where women became elevated in Europe and in North America also, even though World War I did not last long for the United States. Nevertheless, it was still a big factor. When the rest of the world gave women the right to vote, the United States did also. All right. Now, this takes us up to spoils system. Or civil service. The spoils system goes back to Andrew Jackson. When Andrew Jackson took office, he said to the victors belong the spoils. That meant he replaced every government bureaucrat he could with men who had supported him. And beginning with him, every president in turn, particularly if it was a president from a different party, would come into office and they would replace the old president's men with new men. Particularly in the civil service. Now, what's the civil service? Men who work for this Interstate Commerce Commission, they're civil service men. Men who work for the FCC and other government agencies. The civil service is your federal bureaucrats who do the backbone work of the federal government. They're appointed, not voted on. Well, every time a president from a new party was elected to office, a bunch of men would converge on Washington and they would say to the new government, not necessarily the president, whom they could not get knowledge of, we supported our president so-and-so, therefore we should have a job. And well, a lot of them did get jobs, but a lot of persons felt that, hey, these civil service agents, number one, they should not be appointed this way, and number two, a lot of times they're corrupt. And how can we make sure that the men and women who operate the backbone of the government, the men and women who carry out the president's orders, the men and women who carry out Congress's orders, how can we make sure that they're not corrupt? And this was to lead to a call for civil service reform. To keep this in mind, this has become a big issue with the election of James Garfield. Well, actually, that's in this chapter also. Rutherford B. Hayes had a really rough time during his term as president. I remember telling you last time, maybe nothing earth-shaking happened. One thing did happen. There was a big labor dispute. The Great Railroad Strike is called. Railroad strike, and the railroads workers went on strike from what we might think of as the best of reasons. Basically, it was overpay. But there is something else going on. Now, this does not go on today. But railroad companies, when they hired a worker, they told this worker, you must move into our house. We have a certain area here that we built up a town. You must move into our town that we built up and pay rent to us, and you must buy from our company store. This was still going on when my grandfather was alive and working. My granddad lived in a company home. Now, eventually these company homes were outlawed. What this meant was that the company you worked for controlled you. You had to buy from the company store. Now, there was a song many years ago called 16 Tons, and one line of it is, you know, the 16 tons and what you get, another day older and deeper in debt. But one line in that song was, St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul at the company store. Any ever heard of the song by any chance? Okay, well, it was really popular when I was younger, but all right, anyway, the company store was where you could go pretty deep into debt to, because again, they knew who you were and they would try to collect. Well, what happened was the company had to lay off its workers during the economic downturn. And folk, this is a sad fact of life that still goes on. Any company, when they start losing money, can lay you off. One of my daughters is laid off right now. Lockheed. In 1971, Lockheed laid off 25,000 workers. They went from 33,000 to 7,000 workers in a year's time. When I was there, they once laid off they went to 20,000 workers to 8,000. They lost 12,000 workers in about a year and a half's time. Again, when they lose a government contract, Lockheed only had one customer. Well, the customers were governments, the United States government and the governments of the world. But when they lost the United States government contract, the workers, a lot of workers could expect to go home. Well, what happened? The railroad laid off a bunch of workers, but they did not reduce the rents. They did not reduce the price at the store. And the workers were still left owing rent money and owing at the company store. And also the the railroad cut wages. They cut wages but kept the rents up and kept the store up. So the workers went on strike, and the strike really hurt interstate commerce. Coal could not be shipped, winter was coming on. President Hayes ordered the federal troops to move in and break up the strike, and even hire strike breakers. But President Hayes felt really badly about what he'd done. He said, I know these workers, I know they're honest, hard-working men. I know they have family support, and I understand their grievances, but nevertheless, I can't let them destroy the country. So he sent his army and moved in, and they broke up the strike. A bunch of people were killed on both sides, and again, this made Hayes feel badly. To make a long story short now, Hayes decided he would not run again. The job was too burdensome for him, too heavy. So the Republicans nominated James Garfield. For vice president, nominated Chet Arthur. Well, Chet Arthur had been collector of the port at New York. He was really wealthy. He was accused of corruption. So President Hayes removed President Hayes had removed Arthur from collector of the port. Keep this in mind because Arthur became president in a short time. Well, Garfield became president, promising that I will reform the civil service. He became president. A man named Guiteau went to Washington expecting a government job. He did not get one. Guiteau, like John Wilkes Booth before him, Mr. Guiteau believed that if he shot Garfield dead, the whole country would be happy. So he shot James Garfield. And instead he wound up getting hung, especially after Garfield died. Now, in the case of Garfield, he lingered for about 3 months between life and death in great pain and finally died. Chet Arthur became president, and a lot of people said, my, it's terrible. Chet Arthur is president. However, Chet Arthur rose to the occasion. He became a fairly good president. He was not as bad for graft and corruption as they thought he would be, but he became a decent president. And he also refused to be told what to do by his political bosses, and that's why if you read your history books, Chet Arthur only served one term, actually half of one term. Now, as I've already mentioned, James Garfield lingered between life and death. In those days, there was no 25th Amendment. If that would have happened today, the 25th Amendment would take over and Arthur would take over until Garfield recovered. But in those days, it was not meant. For 3 months, our country was without a president. And for 3 months, like for instance, Clara Barton was trying to get the Red Cross established, and she heard that James Garfield was on her side, and the next thing she heard, Garfield has been shot. And nobody knew. Then Chet Arthur became president. He was at least interested in establishing the Red Cross, so Clara Barton had to wait. Now, eventually she got the Red Cross in America. Now, I must say this, folks, on the subject of presidents being shot. Well, first of all, they took out his assassin's brains, a man named Guiteau. They took out his brains to try to figure out what would make a man act that way. To this day, I mean, they didn't have the means to do that. We don't either. What would make a man turn bad, you just can't tell by studying his brain. I will say this, though. I myself sometimes enjoy reading about bad people, not to want to become like them. But one day I happened to notice my daughter was researching on her computer. She was looking up Jesse James, John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Babyface Nelson, Machine Gun Kelly, Al Capone. Any of you know anything about these men? Well, and women too. They were all bad people. I said, go ahead. I do that myself. I said, when I was younger, I used to think that I might find out what could make a person bad, but now we're like, we don't know that. We still don't. Sometimes they just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, I think, a lot of it. Adolf Eichmann, he justified, said, I was told what to do, but if I didn't do what I was told, he was going to kill me. I mean, and there was a lot of truth in this. He was involved in killing of 6 million Jews. But he justified it on the grounds that I had to take orders, and I had to obey orders. Jesse James was a Confederate soldier. When the Confederacy lost, some Union soldiers shot him in the leg, and he took up. But Jesse James believed, like other bad people have believed, that if I help the poor with the money I steal, then that's a good cause. So if Jesse James would sometimes see a poor farmer in rags who looked like a dirt poor farmer and give the man some money, thinking that was justifying their bad deeds. I don't think so, folk. Don't think so at all. Now, the other thing I want to say on the subject, there's a story going around, folks. Now, again, I say this because I was not told this in the school. At least you can determine what you want to. I mean, but we're all adults. There's a story that in 1840, an Indian chieftain got really mad at William Henry Harrison, cursed the president. He said, let every president elected in a 0 year die in office. In 1840, the country elected William Henry Harrison. Within 1 month, William Henry Harrison was dead. In 1860, we elected Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was shot dead. In 1880, we elected James Garfield. Within 3 months or so, James Garfield died. In 1900, now we actually elected William McKinley first in 1896. We re-elected William McKinley in 1900 and 1901. William McKinley shot dead. In 1920, we elected Warren Harding. 1923, Warren Harding died under mysterious circumstances, possibly poisoned by his wife, possibly committing suicide, or possibly just took sick and died. We don't know. In 1940, we actually elected Roosevelt in 1932, but we re-elected him in 1930 and re-elected again in 1940. Roosevelt died in office. In 1960, and this, and I'm old enough to remember, we elected John Kennedy. John Kennedy shot dead after a little bit less than 3 years in office. But in 1980, we elected Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was shot really close to his heart. His doctors were pulled out. If the right doctor had gotten to Lincoln, we believe the right doctor. If today's doctors had gotten to Garfield, we believe today's doctors could have pulled Garfield through, and possibly William McKinley also. But now John Kennedy, he was gone. His brains were knocked out. He was pretty well gone. But anyway, today's doctors pulled Ronald Reagan through, and Ronald Reagan lived a good many years after being shot. 2000, we elected George Bush. He survived. In 2020, that's still up in the air, folk. But the presidential curse seemed to have been broken by Ronald Reagan. But he was hit by an assassin's bullet. All right. Again, you can make of that anything you want to. You might hear a little bit about the presidential curse mystery. Now, Congress was so outraged by James Garfield's assassination. Now, again, we don't hear much about Garfield's assassination, but if you look at the newspapers at the time, they talked about it for months. For one thing, it took Garfield 3 months to die, and every day there'd be something in the news about it. And the country was very, very outraged. Now today, of course, we've largely forgotten about it. But the country was outraged, and they finally got to work on passing a Civil Service Reform Act. Today, to get a civil service job, you must pass a test. And if you've had time in the military, you get 5 points added to your score off the top, which means that former soldiers, former sailors, have a better shot at getting a civil service job, but it's all done supposed by merit, and politics has nothing to do with it. And some of our federal bureaucrats have lasted many years. J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI for some 40 years through both Republican and Democratic presidents, but our federal bureaucrats remain in office. Now, what I'm saying about civils does not apply to jobs in the cabinet, like Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Secretary of HEW. Those jobs are still, they change every time that there's a new president. And with some presidents, like Bill Clinton and this one we have now, Donald Trump, they change pretty regularly. I mean, high up government officials get turned around often. High turnover. Again, take it for what you will, folk. All right. Okay, I've come to the end of the chapter here. Wait a minute. No, I haven't either. I'm sorry, I've got it on the wrong page. The next president, I said, Chet Arthur. One of the bills that was passed while he was in office was the Sherman Antitrust Act. That did not really do a lot to curb trust initially, but in the long run it did. Now, the next president after Arthur was Grover Cleveland. Cleveland was the only president we've had who served 2 non-consecutive terms. Now, by act of Congress, Cleveland goes down in history as the 22nd and the 24th President of the United States. In other words, Donald Trump is called the 45th president, but if you actually count him, we've only had 44 presidents. Why? We count Grover Cleveland twice.
So he was the
He was the 22nd president.